Asterisk. The moment you stop talking, people start respecting you. There is a moment that changes everything. It does not arrive with fanfare. It does not announce itself with dramatic music or a life-altering event that everyone around you can see. It arrives quietly, almost invisibly, in the space between one breath and the next, in the pause between one sentence and the silence that follows it. It is the moment you stop talking. Not because you have nothing to say, not because you are afraid to speak, not because someone told you to be quiet, but because something inside you has shifted at a level so fundamental that the old patterns of constant expression, constant justification, constant explanation, constant performance simply no longer feel necessary. Something inside you has arrived at a recognition that most people spend their entire lives running from. The recognition that your words have been costing you far more than they have been giving you. That your constant availability for conversation has been draining something precious from your presence. That your eagerness to fill every silence has been slowly, imperceptibly, but devastatingly eroding the respect that the people around you have for you. And in that moment of recognition, in that quiet, private, deeply personal moment of seeing the truth clearly for the first time, you make a choice. You choose to stop, not forever, not in all situations, not as a rigid rule or a performance of your own, but as a fundamental reorientation of your relationship with your own voice. A reorientation that says, from now on, my words will be chosen, not compulsive. My speech will be deliberate, not automatic. My silence will be a statement, not an absence. And what happens next, in the hours and days and weeks and months that follow that choice, is one of the most remarkable transformations that a human being can experience. Because when you stop talking, people start respecting you. Not because silence is inherently virtuous, not because quietness is inherently admirable, but because something about the quality of your presence changes when you stop diluting it with unnecessary words. Something about the way people experience you shifts when you stop filling every available space with sound. Something about your value in the eyes of others transforms when you stop making yourself so abundantly, so cheaply, so unconditionally available through the constant currency of your speech. And today I want to take you into the deepest possible understanding of why this happens, how it works, what it means, and how it can change not just your relationships but your entire experience of being alive. Let me begin with something that will sound harsh, but that I believe is profoundly true. Most people talk too much. Not occasionally, not in certain situations, but consistently, pervasively, as a default mode of being that they have never examined and never questioned. They talk when they are happy. They talk when they are sad. They talk when they are anxious. They talk when they are bored. They talk when they have something meaningful to say. They talk when they have nothing meaningful to say. They talk to connect. They talk to avoid connection. They talk to impress. They talk to deflect. They talk to fill silence. They talk to escape silence. They talk because talking has become so automatic, so habitual, so deeply wired into their behavioral repertoire that the idea of not talking, simply being present in a conversation or a room or a relationship without contributing words, feels not just uncomfortable, but almost impossible. And because this excessive talking is so universal, so normalized, so rarely identified as a problem, most people never consider the possibility that their words are not adding to their lives but subtracting from them. They never consider that their constant verbal output is not building their relationships but eroding them. They never consider that their eagerness to speak is not demonstrating their intelligence but undermining their authority. They never consider that the very thing they believe is connecting them to the people around them is actually creating distance. Invisible, subtle, almost undetectable distance, but distance nonetheless. Distance that grows with every unnecessary word. Distance that widens with every compulsive explanation. Distance that deepens with every reflexive opinion offered to a room that did not ask for it. Why does this happen? Why does talking too much create distance rather than connection? Why does constant speech undermine respect rather than build it? The answer lies in something fundamental about human psychology, something so basic that it operates beneath conscious awareness in virtually every social interaction. And that something is the principle of value through scarcity. Human beings are wired, at a deep evolutionary level, to value what is scarce and to take for granted what is abundant. This principle applies to resources, to opportunities, to experiences, and it applies with remarkable consistency to people's words. When someone speaks rarely, when their words are infrequent and therefore unexpected, each word carries weight. Each statement lands with impact. Each contribution to a conversation feels like a gift, precisely because it is not guaranteed. The rarity of their speech creates a gravitational field around their words that pulls attention toward them automatically, effortlessly, without any need for the speaker to demand or pursue that attention. But when someone speaks constantly, when their words are abundant and therefore predictable, the opposite happens. Each word carries less weight. Each statement lands with less impact. Each contribution to a conversation feels less like a gift and more like background noise. Not because the content is necessarily less valuable, but because the abundance of their speech has trained the people around them to expect it, to take it for granted, to tune it out the way you tune out the hum of an air conditioner. You know it is there. You would probably notice if it stopped, but you have stopped listening to it. You have stopped giving it your attention. And this is precisely what happens to the words of someone who talks too much. The people around them stop listening, not dramatically, not obviously, not in a way that the talker can easily identify, but gradually, subtly, in the small ways that accumulate over time. The slight glazing of the eyes, the almost imperceptible shift in body language, the response that addresses only the last sentence because the listener stopped tracking the rest of the monologue 3 sentences ago. The polite nod, that means nothing. The that is not agreement but merely acknowledgement that sound is being produced. These are the signs of someone who has stopped listening, and they are the inevitable consequence of being subjected to an abundance of speech that the listener did not request and does not value. Marcus Aurelius wrote something in his Meditations that I believe cuts to the heart of this issue with surgical precision. He wrote, "Speak only when what you have to say is better than silence." And this sounds simple. It sounds like common sense. It sounds like something that anyone would agree with. But watch what happens when you actually try to apply it. When you actually rigorously, honestly evaluate each thing you are about to say against the standard of whether it is genuinely better than silence, what you discover is shocking. Because the vast majority of what you say, perhaps 80 or 90% of it, does not meet this standard. It is not better than silence, it is just noise, filler, habit. The automatic verbal output of a mind that has never been trained to discriminate between speech that adds value and speech that merely adds volume. And when you begin to apply Marcus's standard, when you begin to withhold the speech that does not meet it, something extraordinary happens. Not to the people around you, though something happens to them too, but to you, to your inner experience, to the quality of your own mind. Because when you stop the constant outflow of speech, when you dam the river of words that has been flowing unchecked for years, the energy that was being channeled into that outflow does not disappear. It redirects, it flows inward, it fills the spaces in your mind that were previously occupied by the constant preparation and delivery and monitoring of speech. And in those newly filled spaces, something begins to grow. Clarity, depth, perspective, the ability to see situations and people and dynamics with an accuracy that was impossible when your mental resources were being consumed by the demands of constant expression. You begin to notice things you never noticed before. You begin to understand things you never understood before. You begin to see patterns, motivations, connections, implications that were always there but that were invisible to you because you were too busy talking to see them. I want to take you into the neuroscience of this for a moment because understanding what is happening in your brain when you stop talking helps to explain why the effects are so dramatic and so far-reaching. When you are speaking, your brain is engaged in an extraordinarily complex and resource-intensive process. It is formulating ideas, selecting words, constructing sentences, monitoring pronunciation, adjusting tone, reading the listener's reactions, modifying the message in real time, managing your emotional state, suppressing alternative thoughts that might interfere with the current line of speech, and simultaneously processing the vast amount of sensory information that is constantly streaming in from the environment. This is an enormous cognitive load. And while the human brain is remarkably capable of managing it, the cost is not zero. The cost is paid in reduced capacity for other cognitive functions. Functions like deep observation, like pattern recognition, like emotional intelligence, like strategic thinking, like creative insight. When you are talking, these functions are operating at reduced capacity because the brain's resources are being heavily allocated to the demands of speech production. But when you stop talking, when you release the cognitive load of speech, those resources become available for other purposes. Your observational capacity increases, your pattern recognition sharpens, your emotional intelligence deepens, your strategic thinking becomes more sophisticated, your creative insight becomes more frequent and more reliable. This is not metaphorical, this is literal, measurable, neurologically verifiable. The person who talks less thinks better, not because they are inherently smarter, but because they have more of their cognitive capacity available for thinking rather than talking. Now, let me connect this to the question of respect, because this is where the practical, relational consequences of this shift become most visible and most important. Respect, in the deepest sense, is not something you can ask for. It is not something you can argue for. It is not something you can earn through words. It is something that is granted to you, often unconsciously, by the people around you based on how they experience your presence. And your presence, the quality of it, the weight of it, the impact of it, is determined far more by what you do not say than by what you do say. Think about the people in your life who you respect the most, not the people you like the most, not the people who make you laugh the most, not the people who are most fun to be around, but the people you genuinely, deeply respect. The people whose opinion matters to you, the people whose approval, even the silent kind, the nod, the look of acknowledgement, makes you feel like you have done something right. What is it about them? If you examine it carefully, you will almost certainly find that these people share a common quality. They do not give their words away freely. They listen more than they speak. They observe more than they react. They process internally rather than externally. And when they do speak, there is a quality to their speech that immediately distinguishes it from ordinary conversation. A quality of weight, of consideration, of having been thought about before being spoken. And this quality, this sense that every word has been chosen rather than emitted, is what creates respect. Not the content of the words, though that matters too, but the quality. The sense that the person values their own speech enough to be selective about when and how they deploy it. Because if they value their own speech, the people around them will value it too. And if they value it, they will listen. And if they listen, they will respect. This is the chain. Self-valuation leads to selectivity. Selectivity leads to weight. Weight leads to attention. Attention leads to respect. And the starting point, the first link in the chain, is the decision to stop talking. Seneca explored this territory with characteristic depth and directness. In one of his letters, he wrote about a friend who had recently become more talkative, and he noted that the increase in speech corresponded with a decrease in substance. The man was saying more, but meaning less. His words had become a river with no current, wide and shallow, covering much ground but carrying no force. And Seneca observed that this was not merely a communication problem, it was a character problem. Because the quality of a person's speech, he believed, is a direct reflection of the quality of their mind. And a mind that produces a constant stream of undifferentiated speech is a mind that has lost its discipline, a mind that has stopped discriminating, a mind that has abandoned the difficult but essential work of separating what is worth saying from what is merely possible to say. And when a mind abandons this work, when it stops filtering its output, when it allows everything to flow through without examination, the person attached to that mind inevitably loses the respect of those around them. Not because their ideas are bad, not because their intentions are wrong, but because the undisciplined outflow of their speech signals something about the state of their inner world that no amount of clever content can overcome. It signals disorder. It signals a lack of self-command. It signals that this person has not mastered the most basic instrument they possess, their own voice. I want to go deeper now into something that I think is one of the most misunderstood aspects of this entire topic, the relationship between silence and confidence. Because most people assume that the confident person is the one who speaks up. who shares their opinion, who makes their presence known through verbal contribution. And in some contexts, this is true. There are situations where speaking up requires genuine courage and where silence would be a form of cowardice. But in the vast majority of everyday social interactions, the opposite is true. The confident person is the one who does not need to speak, who does not need to prove their intelligence by sharing every thought, who does not need to establish their relevance by contributing to every conversation, who does not need to manage how they are perceived by carefully curating their verbal output for maximum impressiveness. The confident person has already settled the question of their own value internally. They do not need the external confirmation that comes from seeing their ideas acknowledged, their opinions validated, their presence noticed through speech. They are complete without that confirmation. And this completeness, this internal settlement, is what allows them to be selective about when they speak. Because they are not speaking to establish their worth. They are speaking only when speaking genuinely serves a purpose. And this distinction, the distinction between speaking from need and speaking from choice, is the distinction between the person who earns respect and the person who chases it. The chaser talks constantly because they need the feedback loop. They need to see the nod, hear the agreement, feel the attention. Every word they speak is a probe, testing the environment, asking the implicit question, do you value me? Do you see me? Am I important here? And the people around them feel this implicit question. They feel the neediness beneath the words, and while they may not consciously identify it, they respond to it with the subtle withdrawal of respect that neediness always produces. But the person who speaks from choice, who talks only when they have something that genuinely merits expression, sends a completely different signal. Their silence says, I do not need this conversation to validate my existence. Their selectivity says, my words are valuable enough to be reserved for moments that deserve them. And these signals, received at the instinctive level by everyone in the room, produce respect. Not demanded, not argued for, not earned through impressive performance, simply generated, naturally and inevitably, by the quality of presence that silence creates. Let me tell you a story. It is not a story about a famous philosopher or a historical figure. It is a story about a pattern I have observed over and over in ordinary life, in offices and families and friendships and communities. A pattern so consistent that I believe it reveals something fundamental about human nature. There is always someone in every group who talks the most, who has an opinion about everything, who fills every silence, who responds to every comment, who volunteers every thought. And this person is often liked. They are often considered funny, interesting, engaging. They are good at parties. They are the life of the room. But they are rarely the most respected person in the room. That distinction belongs to someone else. Someone who is usually standing slightly apart. Someone who is present but not performing. Someone who listens with genuine attention but contributes with remarkable restraint. Someone who, when they do finally speak, commands instant attention, not because they raise their voice, but because their silence has raised the value of their words to such a degree that the room automatically quiets to hear them. And here is what is fascinating about this pattern. The person who talks the most usually does not see it. They do not realize that their constant speech is costing them the very thing they are trying to earn through it. They believe that their verbal contribution is building their status, demonstrating their intelligence, establishing their relevance, and in a superficial sense, it is. People know who they are. People enjoy their company. People include them. But respect, deep respect, the kind that translates into genuine influence and genuine authority and genuine trust, this does not come from being entertaining. It comes from being weighty, and weight requires space. Weight requires density. Weight requires the compression of value into a small number of carefully chosen words rather than the diffusion of value across an endless stream of casual speech. Epictetus made an observation about this that I think is one of the most practically useful pieces of wisdom in all of Stoic philosophy. He said, "Be silent for the most part, and speak only when you must, and then briefly. And when called upon to speak, never speak of trivial things, of gladiators or horse races or athletes or food and drink, the vulgar topics of conversation, and above all, do not speak of other people, blaming or praising them or comparing them. This is remarkably specific advice, and if you follow it even approximately, the transformation in how people perceive you is immediate and dramatic. Because what Epictetus is describing is a form of verbal curation that is so rare, so unusual, so completely at odds with the way most people communicate, that anyone who practices it stands out instantly, not through what they say but through what they refuse to say. They refuse to engage in gossip. They refuse to share trivial opinions. They refuse to fill time with empty chatter. And this refusal, this consistent, visible, unapologetic refusal, communicates something about their character that no words could express. It communicates seriousness, depth, self-command, a respect for the value of speech that most people have never considered. And these are the qualities that generate respect. Not cleverness, not eloquence, not the ability to dominate a conversation, but the ability to rise above the noise, to stand apart from the endless stream of trivial speech that constitutes most human communication, to be the person who speaks only when something genuinely needs to be said, and then to say it with precision, with weight, with the unmistakable authority of someone who has something to say and knows exactly how to say it. Now I want to explore what happens inside you when you commit to this practice. Because the external effects, the increased respect, the heightened attention, the perceived authority are only part of the story. The internal effects are equally dramatic and perhaps more important. When you stop talking, when you genuinely, consistently reduce your verbal output and increase your observational input, your relationship with your own thoughts changes fundamentally. In the old pattern, the pattern of constant speech, your thoughts existed in a kind of shallow cycle. A thought would arise, you would express it, you would receive a response to your expression, and then a new thought would arise in response to the response, and the cycle would continue. This cycle kept your thoughts at the surface. They never had time to sink. They never had the opportunity to deepen, to connect with other thoughts, to develop into something more than a momentary reaction to the most recent stimulus. But when you stop the cycle, when you hold your thoughts instead of expressing them, something remarkable happens. The thoughts begin to sink. They begin to move below the surface. They begin to connect with other thoughts that are already down there. Thoughts from previous experiences, from previous reflections, from previous moments of insight that were expressed too quickly to fully develop. And as these connections form, as the thoughts deepen and interweave, something emerges that is qualitatively different from the thoughts you were producing in the cycle of constant expression. What emerges is understanding, not information, not opinion, not reaction, but genuine understanding. The kind of understanding that cannot be arrived at quickly, that cannot be produced on demand, that can only develop in the quiet, dark, undisturbed depths of a mind that has been given time and space to do its own work. This understanding changes everything. It changes how you see yourself. It changes how you see other people. It changes how you interpret events and situations and dynamics that previously confused you. It gives you a kind of clarity that is almost impossible to describe to someone who has never experienced it, but that is instantly recognizable once you have. It is the clarity of someone who has stopped reacting to the surface of life and started perceiving the currents beneath it. Someone who sees not just what is happening but why it is happening, not just what people are saying but what they mean, not just what they are doing but what is driving them. And this clarity, this deep, quiet, slowly developed understanding of the way things actually work, is the foundation of everything the Stoics meant by wisdom. Not book knowledge, not philosophical theory, but the practical, lived, embodied wisdom that comes from having observed life carefully and long enough to understand its patterns. Marcus Aurelius demonstrated this wisdom constantly in his meditations. He was not writing abstract philosophy. He was recording the insights of a mind that had spent years observing, reflecting, processing, and understanding. And the quality of those insights, their precision, their depth, their startling applicability to situations he could never have imagined, is a direct testament to the power of the practice we are discussing. The practice of saying less and thinking more. The practice of reducing output and increasing input. The practice of choosing silence over speech and allowing the silence to do its extraordinary, invisible, transformative work, Let me now take you into territory that is deeply personal and deeply practical. I want to talk about what happens to your relationships when you stop talking, because this is where the effects of this practice are most visible, most dramatic, and most life-changing. When you stop talking in your relationships, when you reduce your verbal output and increase your presence and your attention, the dynamics of those relationships shift in ways that are almost impossible to achieve through any other means. Here is why. In most relationships, there is an implicit contract, an unwritten, unspoken agreement about who plays what role. One person is the talker, the other is the listener. One person is the pursuer, the other is the pursued. One person gives more, the other takes more. One person is more invested, the other is more casual. These roles are established early in the relationship, usually within the first few weeks or months, and once established, they tend to persist indefinitely. They become the relationship's default operating mode, and they are very difficult to change through conversation alone, because talking about the dynamic is itself part of the dynamic. The person who is unhappy with the imbalance tries to explain their dissatisfaction, which reinforces their role as the one who is more invested, which reinforces the other person's role as the one who has the luxury of being pursued, which deepens the very imbalance the conversation was meant to address. It is a trap, a linguistic trap, a conversational trap, and the only way out of it is to stop talking. When you stop talking, you break the pattern. You disrupt the operating mode that the relationship system cannot predict or accommodate within its existing framework. And this disruption forces a renegotiation. Not a verbal renegotiation, with its inherent risk of reinforcing the old pattern, but a behavioral renegotiation. A renegotiation that happens through actions rather than words, through presence rather than persuasion, through the undeniable reality of changed behavior rather than the easily dismissed promise of future change. When you stop talking in a relationship, the other person is confronted with a version of you they are not accustomed to, a version that is less available, less predictable, less eager to fill the space with words, less willing to carry the conversational burden, less ready to process their emotions for them, less eager to manage the relationship's temperature through constant verbal adjustment. And this confrontation produces one of two responses, and both are valuable. The first possible response is that the other person steps up. They begin to contribute more. They begin to initiate more. They begin to carry a share of the conversational and emotional weight that you were previously carrying alone. They notice your silence and, rather than being annoyed by it, are inspired by it to become more present, more engaged, more genuinely participatory in the relationship. This is the best-case scenario, and it happens more often than you might expect, because many people do not realize how passive they have become in a relationship until the other person stops compensating for their passivity. Your silence holds up a mirror that shows them their own inactivity. And for people who genuinely care about you, this mirror is a wake-up call. The second possible response is that the other person does not step up. They do not increase their contribution. They do not become more present or more engaged. Instead, they withdraw further. They become irritated by your silence. They accuse you of being cold, of being difficult, of having changed. And in their withdrawal and their irritation, they reveal something your talking was previously obscuring. They reveal that their investment in the relationship was contingent on you doing most of the work, that they were comfortable in the dynamic precisely because it asked so little of them, that the relationship as it existed was a service you were providing rather than a partnership you were sharing. And this revelation, while painful, is one of the most important things you can ever learn about a relationship. Because it tells you, clearly and unmistakably, what you are actually dealing with. Not what you hoped you were dealing with. Not the fantasy you constructed to justify your continued investment, but the reality. And reality, however harsh, is always better than fantasy. Because you can work with reality. You can make decisions based on reality. You can build a genuinely good life on reality, but you can build nothing lasting on fantasy. I want to go even deeper now, into the relationship between silence and personal authority. Because this is where the practice we are discussing connects to something much larger than social dynamics or relationship strategy. It connects to the fundamental question of how you show up in the world. What kind of presence you bring to every room you enter. What kind of energy you project. What kind of force you exert on the people and situations around you. And the answer to all of these questions is determined, to a remarkable degree, by your relationship with your own voice. Here is what I mean. Every person projects a certain energetic frequency into the world. This is not mystical or metaphysical. It is psychological and physiological. It is the sum total of your body language, your facial expressions, your breathing patterns, your muscle tension, your posture, your eye contact, and yes, your speech. All of these elements combine to create what people instinctively perceive as your presence. And the quality of that presence determines, more than any other single factor, how people respond to you. Now here is the crucial point. Your speech is one of the most powerful modifiers of your presence. It can enhance it or it can dilute it. And in most cases, for most people, it dilutes it. Because most speech carries with it a subtle but detectable energetic signature of need. The need to be heard, the need to be validated, the need to be interesting, the need to be relevant, the need to fill the space. And this energetic signature of however faint, however well hidden beneath clever or confident-sounding words, is picked up by the people around you at a level that is below conscious awareness, but that powerfully influences their response to you. They cannot identify what they are sensing, they cannot name it, but they feel it, and they respond to it with the subtle withdrawal of respect that neediness always produces. But when you stop talking, when you remove the speech that carries this energetic signature of need, something remarkable happens to your presence. It purifies. The need drains out. What remains is just you, your body, your attention, your awareness, your being. Without the overlay of verbal performance, without the distortion of linguistic need, without the static of compulsive expression, just the clean, undiluted signal of a human being who is fully present and fully at ease with their own silence. And this purified presence, this undiluted being, is extraordinarily powerful. It commands attention without demanding it. It generates respect without requesting it. It creates authority without claiming it. Not because silence is magical, but because silence removes the barriers that normally stand between your genuine self and the perception of others. It removes the noise that normally obscures the signal. It allows the people around you to see you, really see you, in a way that your words were actually preventing. This might sound paradoxical. You might think that words help people see you by giving them information about who you are. But the truth is more complex. Words give people a curated version of who you are, a managed version. A version that has been filtered through your desire to be perceived in a particular way. And this curated version, no matter how skillfully constructed, is always less compelling than the raw, unmanaged reality of a person who is simply present. Because we are wired, at a deep evolutionary level, to trust what is unmanaged over what is managed, to trust behavior over speech, to trust presence over presentation, and the person who stops talking and simply is, who lets their presence speak without the interference of their words, triggers this deep trust in a way that the most eloquent speaker in the world cannot match. Let me bring Aristotle into this conversation, because his understanding of human virtue is directly relevant to what we are discussing. Aristotle believed that virtue, true excellence of character, was not something you could claim through words. It was something you demonstrated through consistent action over time. He called it hexis, which roughly translates to a settled disposition, a habitual state of being. Not something you perform when convenient, not something you claim when it serves you, but something you are consistently, reliably, regardless of the circumstances. And this concept of hexis, of virtue as a settled disposition rather than a verbal claim, maps perfectly onto the principle we are exploring. Because the respect that silence generates is not the respect that comes from a single impressive speech or a single moment of restraint. It is the respect that comes from a settled disposition of selectivity, a habitual state of weighing your words, a consistent pattern of choosing silence over noise, observation over reaction, quality over quantity. When people see this pattern, when they observe it over time, across situations, through different circumstances, they begin to attribute to you a quality that is almost impossible to earn through speech alone. They begin to see you as substantial. as someone whose inner world has depth, as someone whose silence is not empty but full of thought, full of observation, full of the kind of careful, disciplined, patient processing that most people are too busy talking to ever engage in. And this perception of substance, of depth, of genuine inner richness is the foundation of the deepest and most durable kind of respect. Not the respect that comes from admiring what you say, but the respect that comes from sensing who you are. Now, I want to address something that is absolutely essential to this discussion, because without it, everything I have said could be dangerously misinterpreted. The practice of stopping talking is not the practice of becoming cold. It is not the practice of withdrawing from human connection. It is not the practice of building walls between yourself and the people who love you. It is not the practice of using silence as a weapon to punish, control, or manipulate others. All of these things are corruptions of a genuinely powerful practice. They are the shadow side of silence, and they produce not respect but fear, not admiration but resentment, not genuine authority but the hollow imitation of it. The silence I am describing, the silence that generates genuine respect, is warm, it is attentive, it is generous. It is the silence of someone who is fully present with you, fully engaged with you, fully interested in you, but who expresses that engagement through attention rather than words, through listening rather than speaking, through the quality of their presence rather than the quantity of their verbal output. This is an important distinction, because the world is full of people who have learned to be quiet as a form of withdrawal, as a way of protecting themselves from vulnerability, as a strategy for avoiding the discomfort of genuine human connection. And these people, while often perceived as strong from a distance, are actually hiding. Their silence is not the silence of fullness. It is the silence of emptiness. It is not the silence of someone who has so much inside them that they do not need to externalize it. It is the silence of someone who has so little inside them, or who is so afraid of what is inside them, that they cannot risk letting any of it out. And people feel this difference not consciously, not intellectually, but instinctively. They feel the difference between the silence of someone who is fully present and choosing not to speak, and the silence of someone who is absent, disconnected, hiding behind a wall of quiet. The first generates respect. The second generates unease. Seneca made a distinction that I think is crucial here. He distinguished between solitude and isolation. Solitude, he said, is the conscious, deliberate choice to be alone with your own mind for the purpose of reflection, growth, and self-knowledge. Isolation is the unconscious, fear-driven retreat from human connection for the purpose of self-protection. The first is strength, the second is weakness dressed up as strength, and the same distinction applies to silence. Deliberate silence, the kind I have been describing, is a choice. A choice made from a position of strength, secure, genuine self-sufficiency. It says, I am choosing to hold my words too much to give them away indiscriminately. Defensive silence, on the other hand, is not a choice. It is a reaction to fear, to vulnerability, to the risk of being seen and judged and found wanting. It says, I am withholding my words because I am afraid of what might happen if I let them out. And the difference between these two kinds of silence, while invisible to the casual observer, is immediately felt by anyone who spends significant time in your presence. The first creates a feeling of safety. People feel that they are in the presence of someone who is grounded, who is secure, who is in command of themselves. The second creates a feeling of tension. People feel that they are in the presence of someone who is hiding, who is guarded, who is managing an anxiety that they refuse to acknowledge. So the practice I am advocating is not the practice of becoming silent. It is the practice of becoming selective. Selective about when you speak, selective about what you say, selective about who receives the gift of your verbal attention, selective about the situations in which you invest your communicative energy. This selectivity is not about withholding, it is about valuing. Valuing your own voice enough to protect it from the dilution that comes from constant indiscriminate use. Valuing your own thoughts enough to give them time to develop before releasing them. Valuing your own presence enough to let it speak for itself, without the constant interference of words that add volume but not value. And when you practice this selectivity consistently, when it becomes your default mode of operation, The transformation in how people respond to you is profound and unmistakable. Not because you have become mysterious, not because you have become impressive, not because you have become intimidating, but because you have become rare. And rare things are valued. This is not manipulation, this is nature. This is the way human psychology works. And the person who understands it and aligns their behavior with it is not gaming the system, they are respecting it. Marcus Aurelius wrote near the end of his Meditations, something that I believe captures the essence of everything we have been discussing. He wrote, "Waste no more time arguing about what a good person should be. Be one." And this sentence, in its devastating simplicity, contains the entire philosophy of silence and respect that we have been exploring. Stop talking about who you are. Stop arguing about what you believe. Stop explaining your values. Stop defending your character. Stop justifying your decisions. Stop performing your identity through an endless stream of words designed to convince the world that you are worth respecting. Instead, be the person whose actions speak. Be the person whose presence communicates. Be the person whose life, quietly lived, consistently directed, deliberately shaped, makes the argument that no words ever could. This is the path, not to speaking better, not to speaking more eloquently or more persuasively or more impressively, but to speaking less and being more, and trusting that the being over time across situations, through the accumulated evidence of a life lived with genuine integrity and genuine self-command, will generate exactly the respect that no amount of words ever could. Let me take you now into something that I have not seen explored anywhere else, but that I believe is one of the most important dimensions of this entire topic, the relationship between stopping talking and emotional maturity. Because I believe that the journey from compulsive speech to deliberate silence is, at its core, a journey of emotional development. And understanding this connection helps to explain not just why silence generates respect, but why the inability to be silent is so common and so persistent. Think about children. Children talk constantly. They narrate their experiences. They share every thought. They demand attention for every observation. They process their emotions externally, out loud, in real time, with no filter and no delay. And this is appropriate. This is how children are supposed to be. Their constant speech is part of their developmental process. They are learning language. They are testing ideas. They are developing their relationship with the external world through the medium of verbal expression. But as children grow, as they develop emotional and cognitive maturity, something is supposed to happen. They are supposed to develop the ability to process internally, to hold thoughts without immediately expressing them, to feel emotions without immediately acting on them, to observe without immediately commenting, to be present without immediately performing. This development, this gradual internalization of processing, is one of the hallmarks of genuine maturity. And yet many adults never complete it. Many adults remain, in their communicative patterns, essentially childlike. They still narrate their experiences. They still share every thought. They still process their emotions externally. They still demand attention for every observation. They have grown physically. They have acquired knowledge and skills and professional capabilities. But their relationship with their own voice has not matured. They still speak from the same place of compulsive need that they spoke from as children. And this immaturity, this arrested development in the realm of verbal self-regulation, is one of the primary reasons that so many people struggle to command genuine respect. Because respect, at its core, is a response to perceived maturity. We respect people who seem to have mastered themselves, who seem to have developed beyond the compulsive, reactive, impulsive patterns of childhood, who seem to be operating from a deeper, more considered, more deliberately chosen set of principles. And the single most visible marker of this kind of maturity, the single most reliable indicator that a person has developed genuine self-command, is their ability to be silent, to hold their words, to process internally, to be present without performing, to observe without commenting, to feel without expressing, to think without speaking. Epictetus captured this perfectly when he taught his students that the mark of a progressing person was less speech and more observation. He was not making a superficial comment about communication style. He was identifying a developmental milestone. The point at which a person stops needing to externalize their inner world and begins to develop the capacity to inhabit it directly. The point at which the constant outflow of speech is replaced by a deeper, quieter, richer relationship with one's own thoughts and perceptions. The point at which the person stops being a child who needs the world to witness every moment of their experience and becomes an adult who can witness their own experience with sufficient depth and presence that external acknowledgement becomes unnecessary. This is the maturation that silence represents, and this is why it generates respect. Not because silence is a performance, not because it is a strategy, but because it is the visible expression of genuine inner development, of a person who has grown beyond the need for constant external validation, who has developed the internal resources to sustain their own sense of self without the continuous feedback loop of speech and response, who has arrived, through whatever combination of experience and reflection and practice and pain, at a place of genuine self-sufficiency. And this self-sufficiency, this settled, quiet, undemanding completeness, is the most respect-generating quality a human being can possess. I want to spend some time now on the practical dimension of how to actually implement this practice in your daily life. Because understanding why silence generates respect is one thing. Actually becoming more silent in a world that constantly pressures you to speak is quite another. And the gap between understanding and implementation is where most people's good intentions go to die. So let me be practical, let me be specific. Let me give you not just philosophy but a roadmap. The first and most fundamental thing you need to do is to develop what I call the internal pause. This is the habit of creating a small gap, even a fraction of a second, between the impulse to speak and the act of speaking. In that gap, you ask yourself one question. Not is this interesting, not is this clever, not will this make me look good, but does this need to be said? Is there a genuine purpose to this speech that cannot be served by silence? If the answer is yes, speak. Speak clearly, speak concisely, speak with purpose. If the answer is no, hold, let the impulse pass. Let the silence stand, and then observe what happens. In most cases, nothing happens. The conversation continues without your contribution. The world keeps turning without your commentary. The moment passes, and no one notices that you did not fill it with words. And this observation, repeated hundreds of times across weeks and months, begins to rewire your relationship with speech at a fundamental level. You begin to see, through direct experience, that most of what you were saying was not necessary, that the world does not need your constant input, that the silence is not as dangerous as you thought it was, that, in fact, the silence is better than what you were putting in its place. The second practical step is to develop the habit of observing rather than commenting. Most people, when they notice something, immediately comment on it. They see something interesting and they say, "Look at that." They hear something surprising and they say, "Did you hear that?" They think something insightful and they share it immediately, before the insight has had time to fully form. This habit of immediate commentary keeps them at the surface of their own experience. It converts every observation into a performance before the observation has had a chance to become understanding. Begin to practice holding your observations, seeing without commenting, noticing without sharing, allowing your perceptions to develop inside you before deciding whether to externalize them. This does not mean never sharing your observations. It means being deliberate about when and how you share them. It means allowing your observations to mature, to connect with other observations, to develop into something richer and more nuanced than the initial raw perception. And when you do share them, sharing them with the weight and precision that comes from having held them long enough for them to develop. The third practical step is to practice listening without waiting to speak. Most people, when they are supposedly listening, are actually just waiting for their turn to talk. They are not fully present with what the other person is saying. They are half listening while internally formulating their response, their comment, their anecdote, their opinion. This is not listening. It is a performance of listening that exists primarily to serve the listener's need to contribute rather than the speaker's need to be heard. Begin to practice genuine listening. Listening where your entire attention is on the other person, where you are not preparing your response, where you are not evaluating what they are saying against your own opinions. where you are simply receiving, taking in, absorbing, understanding, and then, when they finish, allowing a moment of silence before deciding whether a response is necessary at all. In many cases, you will find that the best response is not words but presence, not commentary but acknowledgement, not your perspective but your attention. And the people in your life will feel the difference. They will feel the difference between being listened to and being waited out. They will feel the difference between being genuinely received and being tolerated until it is the other person's turn to talk. And they will respond to that difference with a depth of connection and a quality of respect that no amount of clever speech could produce. The fourth practical step, and this is perhaps the most challenging, is to practice tolerating the discomfort of silence, because there will be discomfort. Your nervous system, which has been trained over years to manage social situations through speech, will interpret silence as danger. It will send signals of anxiety. It will create urgency. It will produce the almost irresistible impulse to say something, anything, to relieve the tension. And you must learn to sit with this discomfort without acting on it. This is the core of the practice. This is where the real work happens, not in understanding the philosophy of silence, not in agreeing intellectually that less speech is more powerful, but in the moment when the silence is stretching and the anxiety is rising and every instinct is screaming at you to speak, and you choose consciously, deliberately, with full awareness of the discomfort, to remain silent. This choice, repeated thousands of times across months and years, is what transforms you. It is what rewires your nervous system. It is what shifts your default from speaking to observing. It is what builds the genuine, unshakable inner authority that generates respect, not as a strategy, but as a natural consequence of who you have become. Let me now take this conversation into the territory of long-term transformation, because the practice we are discussing is not something that produces its full effects in days or weeks. It produces its full effects over months and years. And the long-term effects are so far-reaching and so profound that they constitute, in my view, one of the most significant personal transformations a human being can undergo. Over the long term, the consistent practice of speaking less and observing more produces a fundamental change in the architecture of your personality. Not a surface-level change, not a behavioral modification, but a deep, structural change in how you relate to yourself, to others, and to the world. The first long-term change is in your relationship with your own mind. As I discussed earlier, the practice of holding your thoughts rather than immediately expressing them creates the conditions for deeper processing, richer understanding, and more original thinking. Over months and years, this deeper processing compounds. Your understanding of the world becomes progressively more nuanced. Your insights become progressively more original. Your judgments become progressively more accurate. And your speech, on the occasions when you do choose to speak, becomes progressively more impactful, because every word you say is backed by months or years of deep, undisturbed internal processing that the constant talker never achieves. The second long-term change is in your emotional life. Most people's emotional lives are characterized by what psychologists call emotional reactivity. They feel something and they immediately express it or act on it. There is no gap between the emotion and the response. And because there is no gap, there is no room for the emotion to be fully felt, fully understood, and fully processed before being converted into behavior. The practice of silence creates this gap. It teaches you to feel without immediately expressing, to experience without immediately acting, to hold your emotions with the same patience and attentiveness that you hold your thoughts. And over time, this practice produces an emotional life that is dramatically different from the reactive default. An emotional life that is deeper, more nuanced, more fully experienced. You feel more, not less, but you express less. And this creates a richness of inner experience that the reactive person never accesses, because their emotions are always being discharged before they have a chance to fully develop. They are always converting their emotional energy into speech or action before the energy has had a chance to teach them what it has to teach. But you, through the practice of holding and observing your emotions rather than immediately expressing them, develop a relationship with your own emotional world that is extraordinarily rich and extraordinarily stable. You become more emotionally intelligent, more emotionally resilient, more emotionally grounded. And this emotional development, like the cognitive development we discussed earlier, is visible to the people around you. They see it in your composure, in your stability, in your ability to remain calm and centered when everyone around you is reactive and destabilized, and they respond to it with respect. Deep, instinctive, almost automatic respect for someone who has clearly mastered something that most people never even attempt to master. Their own inner world. The third long-term change is in your relationships. Over time, the practice of speaking less transforms not just how you relate to individual people, but the entire ecosystem of your social life. People who do not belong in your life, who were drawn to you primarily because of your availability or your willingness to carry the conversational burden, will gradually drift away. They will seek out other sources of the constant verbal engagement they need. And people who do belong in your life, who are drawn to your genuine self rather than your performance, will draw closer. They will appreciate the depth of your attention. They will value the rarity of your words. They will respect the quality of your presence. And the relationships that remain, the ones that survive the transition from constant speech to deliberate silence, will be qualitatively different from the ones that preceded them. They will be deeper, more authentic, more mutual, more nourishing, more genuinely connected, because they will be based not on the exchange of words but on the exchange of presence. Not on the currency of conversation, but on the currency of genuine attention and genuine care. I want to bring this entire conversation to its deepest point now, because everything I have said about silence and respect and authority and transmission point toward a single fundamental truth that the Stoics understood better than anyone. The truth is that you are not your words. You are not your opinions. You are not your commentary on the world. You are not the stories you tell about yourself, or the explanations you offer for your behavior, or the justifications you construct for your decisions. You are something beneath all of that. Something quieter, something more permanent, something that exists prior to language and beyond language, and in the spaces between language. Something that can only be experienced in the silence. And the practice of speaking less is, at its deepest level, the practice of returning to that something, reconnecting with it, learning to live from it, rather than from the surface-level noise of constant verbal expression. When you speak from that place, when you speak from the deep, quiet center of your being rather than from the reactive, anxious, performative surface, your words have a quality that is unmistakable, a quality of groundedness, of authenticity, of genuine authority. People feel it immediately. They cannot explain what is different about your speech. But they know that something is different. They know that your words are coming from a deeper place than most people's words come from. And they respond to that depth with a respect that is equally deep. Not the shallow respect that comes from being impressed by clever speech, but the deep respect that comes from sensing that you are in the presence of someone who has found their own ground, who knows who they are, who does not need the world to tell them, and who speaks, when they speak at all, from a place of such genuine certainty and such genuine self-knowledge that their words carry the weight of an entire life lived in conscious, deliberate, patient silence. Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, Epictetus, Aristotle, the greatest minds in the Stoic and philosophical tradition understood this. They practiced this. They built their lives around this. Not because they were naturally quiet people, not because they lacked the ability or the desire to express themselves, but because they understood, with the kind of clarity that only comes from deep reflection and honest self-examination, that the path to genuine authority, genuine respect, genuine power, genuine wisdom does not run through the mouth. It runs through the mind, through the heart, through the quiet, unspoken, deeply felt center of a person who has learned that the most powerful statement they can make is the one they choose not to make. That the most commanding presence they can project is the presence that does not need to be projected at all. That the most respected version of themselves is the version that has stopped trying to be respected and has simply become the kind of person that respect naturally gravitates toward. And that version, that quiet, grounded, self-possessed, deeply real version of you, is available right now, not tomorrow, not after another course or another book or another video. Right now, in this moment, in the breath you are taking right now, in the silence that follows this breath, in the choice to hold your next words just a little longer than usual, to observe a little more carefully, to listen a little more deeply, to be a little more present, to let your presence, your full, undiluted, unmanaged presence, speak for itself, and then to watch with quiet amazement as everything around you begins to change. Not because you did something dramatic, but because you stopped doing something unnecessary. You stopped talking, and the world finally began to listen. If this spoke to something real inside you, if it touched a truth that you have been sensing for a long time but never heard articulated in quite this way, then you know this channel is not about entertainment. It is about becoming. Subscribe, because every time we meet here we go deeper. Every conversation strips away another layer of noise and brings you closer to the signal that has been waiting for you underneath it all. The signal of your own genuine self. I will see you in the next one.